Hello everyone, we are servicing an R series BMW motorbike. To be more exact, it's my 1975 R75/6. I bought this bike over 40 years ago now, and since then we've covered more than 140,000 miles together. In the previous videos, we pushed the bike down to the workshop, pumped it up on the hydraulic workbench, then changed the oils and the filters. We also removed both carburetors, and it's those little beauties we're going to be taking an in-depth look at in this video. I will show you where every air and petrol wave resides within the carb and how to make sure that they're clear. You don't need an ultrasonic cleaner, and I won't be using one. However, if you do have one at your disposal, you should use it, as it makes the cleaning process a little easier. If I know the bike's going to be off the road for a while, say a month or more, I'll make sure the fuel is turned off, then remove, drain and replace the float bowls of both carburetors. Why do I do this, I hear you cry? Well, to enable the floats in the carburetors to work correctly, the float bowls must have a breather to the outside world. These breather passages, they're open all the time and petrol will evaporate through them. As petrol evaporates, the lighter hydrocarbons in it whiz away first. They leave a thicker residue which becomes gooey over time and can bung up the internals of your carburetor. So, by removing petrol from the float bowl, it will minimise any deposits left inside the carburetor by any remaining fuel that is evaporating. Well, both carburetors were drained months ago. Then, when I pulled the petrol pipes off, I was surprised and a little perturbed to find them both full of fuel. If there's petrol in the petrol pipes, then the carburetors are going to be full as well. And this is not good news. It turned out that one of the petrol taps had started to leak. Luckily not to the outside world, it just allowed fuel to flow to the carburetors. The downside of this is all that time evaporation has been taking place through the breathers of the carburetor. Oh dear, what horrors await us within the die-cast cases of these carburetors. And so, without more of an ado, let's get stuck into the resurrection of the Bing carburetors. I've opened up the doors of the workshop to let out the fumes and get to cleaning the outside of the carburetors with petrol. Try not to use a screwdriver when you're doing this to scrape off the gunge, as it may scratch the aluminium housing. I use a brush and also a bamboo kebab skewer. They work quite well, they're nice and hard and you can get right into the corners. Once the first carb is cleaned, I clean the metal tray that I've just cleaned it in, and then dirty it again with all the muck from a second carburetor. This is a carburetor we've just taken off the bike. It's off the right hand side as the rider sits on it. Now, we loosened this operating lever and we had to take that off, and this is the choke. That part there with the square cover on, this is the choke part of the carburetor. So we take the operation lever off and the cover is held on with these 4 screws. This is the meter for the choke. You see that there's a disc here and it has a series of orifices. They meter the fuel that goes into the engine when the choke has been put on. So that is the choke operation. Now under this cover we have a diaphragm, and that lifts the slide of the carburetor and makes the engine go vroom. Now we need to take out these 4 screws, and if you use the handle of the screwdriver, that loosens it and now it comes off. And we just lift the cover like that, and there's the inside of that cover, and we'll put it down over here. Now what you can see just here is the diaphragm. That's the black donut. What's in the center is the top of the slide. Now the diaphragm comes away from the carburetor. You can see me just peeling it away here, and one side, which is just there, you'll see that there's a tooth in the edge of the diaphragm, just there. Can you see it? And that tooth goes down into that aperture just there, and that tooth and that aperture is the thing which keeps the slide in the correct position, because this slide can actually spin around. It's not keyed at all, and that's the thing that keeps it all lined up. And it has to go in the right way round, because if I lift this up and bring it over, you'll see that there are 2 holes in the bottom of the slide there, and they are between the the air filter side of the carb and the butterfly valve, and those holes allow the depression to come up to the top of the diaphragm, which then lifts the slide. Anyway, that's the slide and the diaphragm out, so we can put that over here. And of course the needle protrudes out from the bottom of the slide as well, and that meters the fuel into the engine. So let's get that out of the way. The next thing I want to take off is the float bowl. Now that's down here, so if I put it like, which way are we? Let's turn it this way round. There, so we've got the engine side of the carburetor is at the top. Now normally this spring is right up against here. Before I brought the carburetor over to the desk, I just pulled it away from there to make it easier for me to pull down. So that spring holds the float bowl in place. The float bowl hasn't got any screws. Now then, it does stick to the gasket. There's a gasket between it and the carburetor body. So with your handle, you tap the side of the float bowl. That will unstick it, and it's unstuck now. So there is the inside of the float bowl. The thing you see sticking up there is the overflow. More on that a little later. Right, this is now the inside of the float chamber. Now the float is held in position by a shaft here, and you can see if I push my finger along here, the shaft comes out. Now on this carburetor it's loose. On my other carburetor it's quite tight. There's milling at the end, and that is an interference fit to these two pegs. On the other carb, on this carb it's not, and it's always been loose ever since I've had the bike. So we take the float off. Now under the float you see a valve there. Now that valve stops the petrol coming into the float chamber when the float floats on sufficient fuel in there that it cuts the flow off. On this side of the float there is a bent piece of metal. This is how you adjust the float height, by bending that piece of metal so that the fuel switches off at the right float height. So we need to pull that out. Let's see, it should just spin around and then come out. It seems to be glued in at the moment. There must be some muck come out of the fuel. We need to work at this to get it loose again. I found this once before, and the way that I unstuck it was by putting some WD-40 on there and then getting a needle and pushing it down the side. The jet itself is square in section, and it has a ball bearing at the bottom, spring-loaded ball bearing just there, and at the other end it's pointed, and that's the valve which stops the petrol coming in when the float gets to the right height. And what I'm going to do is squirt a little bit of WD-40 here. Now the reason that the jet itself is square and not round is it has holes up the side which allows the fuel to bubble past it into the float chamber, and we can take advantage of those and then push the pin up the gaps between there. See, it fits in quite nicely there, so we've got a larger gap on that side and a thinner gap here. Now what that means is you can push the pins on the tight side and that will push the jet over. And once we get a bit of movement in there and goes backwards and forwards, it will ungoo itself. Can you see it wobbling backwards and forwards? I wonder if I can get it to spin. Oh, I can. Oh, there we go, it's gone now. I wonder if we try with a little magnet. This one isn't very strong, unfortunately. Oh, but it's good enough. And it's now sticking out by about 3 or 4 millimeters, so if I get it on the side here I should be able to pull it out. And there you go. And that's the needle jet. That's well gummed up. Yeah, there's just definitely something in the fuel that's come down, and as the fuel's evaporated it's left a residue behind, and that's built up and glooped it all together. Last couple of things to come off now. We have the main jet just here. I've got an 8mm spanner, and that comes off thus, and it has this large washer on. I don't know why that washer is so large, but that's the main jet. We'll be looking at that in a moment. There's another jet there which is the idle jet. Let's get the screwdriver in there and push hard down on this one because you don't want to chew up the top now. I just felt it go. The reason I want to take the jets out is because I want to check all the little airways within the carburetor and blow them out to make sure they're all clear. And there we go. Ooh, yep, there's a lot of muck in there as well. Right, that needs to be cleaned out. The idle air control screw is here. I'm going to take that out, and there's a lot of rubbish in here as well, so all that needs clearing out. And that is the carburetor near enough stripped down. Let's remove the needle jet now. And the needle jet, if we turn the carburetor over and look down there, that hole just down there, that's where the needle goes in, and you see that it has a shroud around. Well, the needle jet and this shroud come out next, and they're actually held in by the main jet support here. So if I get a 10mm spanner, and we will, this is a little bit tight, right, that's gone, and that's gone loose. Right, so this is the main jet support that comes out. This has an O-ring seal at the bottom of it, and this is a clamp in that thread, and it clamps onto the main jet on that face there, that shiny face. Now that shroud that is poking up, where'd it go? Oh, there. Oh, that's the needle jet fallen out, and now you push down on that part there, and that's the shroud fallen out. So what we have, that was the shroud, and that's the needle jet, and they fit together like that. So you have the shroud goes into the hole first, then the needle jet, and then the main jet support, and then the main jet itself goes into the top of that. So that's the whole jet assembly for the center of the carburetor. We need to clear all of this out, but I'll be talking some more about that main jet in a moment. The last thing to check is the butterfly. Now, to turn the carburetor around, the butterfly operating arm is just here, and as I push that like that, if we look in here, the butterfly, which is just there, will open and close, open and close. Now it's spring return, and I want to check the amount of wear on the shaft. You can't really do that when it's closed because the butterfly itself jams against the side of the hole. So we need to take off the return spring, which is that one there. Now just put in a pair of pliers here, little needle nose pliers, and then you can pull the end up and bring it out. And there we go, there's the spring. Now, because this spring pulls all the time on the operating lever, I've noticed that over the years, where that spring actually pulls, just in here, has been wearing, and we've got to be about a quarter of the way through the lump of metal there. So I'm keeping my eye on that. Right, now we've got the butterfly return valve off, I can open it up, and then with it open, I can grab hold. In fact, let's do it this way around because I can get my finger. I get my finger in here on one side of the butterfly, and then my finger here, and I can pull it backwards and forwards and see if I can feel any clearance in the shaft. And I can't. That's solid. That's good. And that finishes the disassembly of this carburetor. I'm now going to clean it all up, and then once I've got it clean, I can show you all the little holes and things you need to check to make sure that they're all clear. This is a dirty main jet. You can see a dark ring just here inside the jet. This is the residue left by the petrol, and it must be cleaned out. The jets, being made of brass, are quite soft. Don't try and clean them out with steel needles or pins, as they may damage the jets. use a length of copper wire as shown here, flatten the end with a hammer and then cut it at an angle with a pair of side cutters. That gives a nice sharp edge. To clean the jet, place it on top of the sharpened copper wire as shown, and now push the jet against the wire and then give it a twist. Turn the jet over and repeat this procedure. Inspect with a magnifying glass and then keep going until the jet is nice and clean. And look at that! It works! The jet is nice and clean. The pilot jet was a little corroded when it came out of the carburetor. I cleaned the outside with wire wool and the holes with copper wire. Thread the jets onto a length of wire before hitting them with your air hose. Many a small item has been blasted into eternity after being blown from the grip of people's loving but slippery fingers. The idle air control screw and its springs were also well corroded. They cleaned up quite well using wire wool on the screw and a small wire brush on the spring. Like everything else in this carburetor, the needle was corroded as well. This part of the needle was within the needle jet. This part in the void on top of the main jet. Although the needle looks quite rough, it only needs a rub with fine wire wool and some WD-40 and it shines again. If you look just here, you can see some very slight wear on the side of the needle. This is caused by the air drawn in by the engine in this direction and it's pushing the needle against the side of the needle jet. I'm using the original needles and jets and they still work just fine. Now all the parts that I've taken off and out of the carburetor are now clean and waiting to go back in. I've tracked down every airway and every petrol way within the carburetor and made sure that they are clear. And I'm going to take you through those now so you'll be able to check your carb. I'm going to start off with petrol. So the petrol comes in here, this is where the petrol pipe will connect, and I use this piece of wire. I don't like sticking screwdrivers or metal bits down these ways just in case I damage anything. And the petrol comes in here and it comes out there. That is where the needle valve, if you remember this little needle valve here, if I put it the right way up, that's the needle valve that fits in there, and the float, which is here, will operate that needle valve. So when you turn the petrol on, petrol floods down here, it comes out of that hole there, fills the float bowl. As the float lifts through this little pad on the back, that pushes against the needle valve, and when it gets to the correct height, the needle valve will close the valve in there and stop the petrol coming in. Now I can see that if I push this down and look down this hole, I can see that the two are lining up and I can blast air down here and it comes out there. So I'm happy that that one is clear. Right, let's look at the operation of the choke. Now the choke is this little assembly here which sits on the side of the carburetor. Now it actually meters air and petrol. When the engine's running, it produces a depression on this side of the carburetor. So this side is sucking, and that's where it gets the energy from to pull the petrol through, because the choke is on top of the float chamber. So the petrol can't flow to this on its own. It's got to be drawn up there. And it comes in through this hole here. Now that hole is drilled into a gallery. You can just see the gallery here, and that goes to that boss and then down this pipe. So if I put an air line up this tube here, the air blows out here, and they're the only two places it goes. So it's a pipe that runs from here to there. So that draws the petrol up from the float chamber. Now this is the float chamber, and that pipe which draws petrol up from the float chamber doesn't sit in the main chamber but in this well on the side. And you'll notice that in this corner here there is a hole right there. So this fills with petrol, and the petrol goes down that hole. Now that hole is connected to this big hole here, but there's a jet in the bottom of it which meters the fuel. So although this is open to the float chamber, it only allows as much fuel as can get through that jet into the mechanism for the choke. So that will get drawn up to this hole here. The air comes in, or can be drawn in, through this hole here, and that hole is just on the open side of the carburetor, which is the the air from the air filter. So with the depression here, the air comes in here to get sucked into the engine, but it can go sideways up into the choke assembly just here. So that's how the petrol gets in, that's how the air gets in, and the petrol air mix goes out through this hole at the top, and this hole goes down and pops out just here. In fact, you can see the end of the wire. If I twiddle the wire, you can see it there. And again, I've pushed compressed air down there, and it's open all the way. So they're the three chambers which allow the choke to function. Before we look at the next part of the choke, I want to add a note about a possible problem you may experience with this jet at the bottom of the well. This jet can get blocked, and if it does, you have starting problems, but only when you need to use the choke and only on one cylinder. Well, if these jets block in both carburettors at the same time, then the starting problem will be with both cylinders, but you'd have to be pretty unlucky for that to happen. Now, the assembly itself here, if I take that arm off and push the centre out, right, now this has to go in the correct way round, and you notice that on the end of the shaft, if I just lean this over, there is a dot, and that dot is off centre, and it goes towards the air filter side of the carburetor, and it needs to go that way around. So if I turn this over, that puts the little metering jets here against the petrol hole, which comes up there, and the slot, which is here, and that lets the petrol into the engine. Again, it's metering it against the larger hole here. So the petrol gets drawn up through the jets. Behind those jets there's a chamber, and that chamber comes out just there. Now, you want that chamber to be clean, and you want the jets to be clean, and they are all the holes and apertures which are to do with the choke. The next air hole we're going to have a look at is this one here. We're on the inlet side of the carburetor. The air filter is off in this direction, and this hole here, it feeds just one place, and it goes down into this aperture here. This is where the main jet sits, also the needle jet at the bottom. Now you can see that the wire goes through to there, and that's the only place it goes to, and it needs blasting out. Now, petrol floods up here through the main jet and feeds the engine, so it goes through the main jet into the needle jet and the needle, and that meters it into the engine. Now, if I show you this, actually called the main jet holder, because the main jet with its large washer screws into the bottom and it fits up this way. So you've got the main jet in the bottom of this, that then pushes the needle jet, which is this piece, into the carb like that, and now that has a shroud around it, which is this piece here. Now, where that wire was coming out in that in the hole where the main jet was, it actually lines up with those little holes there. You see them holes there? And what it does, the air that comes in through that airway feeds into those holes, and you've got to remember, this is now the inside of the carburetor, and you've got the venturi, and the slide is above it. So there's a low pressure zone here which is drawing fuel out through the needle jet and into the engine. To help that atomize, and I think that's why it's there, they have this air feed coming in that goes through those holes, and it comes up around the needle jet. So you have air coming up, and I think that helps with the atomization of the fuel before it goes into the engine. The thing is, if that air hole is blocked, the engine doesn't work properly and you get a bit of a misfire. Now, you may have come across this before, because one of the design features with this carburetor is that air hole which allows the air to go into the main jet, is right at the bottom of the tube that comes down from the engine. Now on the right hand carburetor on the R75, the engine breathes down here, and what that means is that the oil mist that comes away from the engine, it puddles, or it can puddle at the bottom here. Now if it gets muck in there as well, then it blocks this hole up, and then you may find that your engine will start misfiring on the right hand side, and all that's wrong is this little airway is blocked. So pull your pipe off, get a piece of wire and poke the wire down here, and that may cure your problem. On the R90s, they breathe into both sides, so you can have that trouble on both sides. So either of your carburettors could start misfiring or causing a misfire because that hole is blocked up. Right, that's that hole done. Before we look at the next air hole, I just want to remove this clip. It's getting in the way here. Now say you want to make a video on how this carburetor works and this clip is getting in your way. This is how to remove it. Put your thumb there, push, and it just lifts out of the hole, and you can take the clip that holds the float chamber bottom off. Right, so that's out of the way. Now the next air hole we're going to have a look at is this one just here. Now it's quite a long hole, and it's all to do with the pilot jet and the idle air control screw. Now this is the top of the float chamber, and you can see where that hole is, and it lines up with that bump there, which is a gallery inside there. So they've drilled a hole from there all the way down here, and you'll notice that there's a bump just there which lines up with that bump, and that's because there's a cross drilling which has come in through here, and then they've blocked the hole up. So that means that the air hole that starts here runs down through this gallery and then turns right and goes up to the bottom end of this hole. That hole is where the pilot jet fits. Now there's also another cross drilling which comes in through that hole just there. Sorry, that's where the hole has been blocked off, but that drilling goes through and it connects the bottom of this hole with the bottom of that hole and connects these together. So if you blast air in through this end here, you should get a draft out there and there. And also this hole is where the idle air control screw fits, which is here. Now it has a spring. The spring is down there, so there's a spring that goes in there first, then the idle air control goes in, and you see that has a sharp point on its end just there, and that's because this meters the air that goes into the engine. So the pilot jet allows a certain amount of fuel to go through depending on the size of its holes, and this is the thing which adjusts the amount of air that gets mixed with the fuel that goes in there, and that air fuel mixture comes up into the carburetor just there, and that lines up with the bottom of that hole. So all those holes have got to be free of air for the carburetor to work properly. This hole here, which is in line with the air screw, that one is connected together, but there's another one as well which is in line with the bottom of the butterfly. It's just down there, and that hole, I'll just get this piece of wire in it, is just there. Now that hole is actually drilled through at that point there and then blocked. But all these holes, with the idle air control screw out and also the pilot jet out, all these holes connect together, and so you need to just, as I said, blast air into one of these ports and just make sure that they're all connected together. And if they're all clear, then you shouldn't have any problems with that particular air hole. The next two holes are here. That one there and that one there. These are two breathers for the float chamber, and they're drilled straight up there, and then there's another hole which is drilled in from the side which joins them in there. That hole just there is drilled through to that big hole here. But both of those need to be clear for the carburetor to work nicely. Staying with the float chamber, this small pipe is the overflow. If the petrol level becomes too high in the float chamber, it will drain down this tube and then all over your right or left boot, depending which carburetor is flooding. As you can see, it's easily cleared with the length of copper wire. Now, if this overflow becomes blocked and the carburetor starts to flood, the fuel level in the float chamber will rise above the blocked overflow pipe and then flood out the two breather holes we've just spoken about at the top of the float chamber. So, if fuel comes out the side of your carburetor when it floods, the chances are the overflow pipe has become blocked. To unblock it, look at the underside of the offending carburetor and clear this hole. This is the top cover of the carburetor. It forms a chamber over the diaphragm and supports the carburetor slide within this boss. To allow proper operation of the carburetor, this hole must be kept clear. Two more holes. I know, this is the carburetor that's always giving. Now, these are breather holes for the diaphragm. If we look down here, you'll see that there are two holes just there and there. And they come in through the back of the carburetor. There's one and the other. And if you look on the air filter side of the carburetor, you can see the holes there, and they need to be clear for the diaphragm to work properly. And also for the diaphragm to work properly, there are two other holes actually within the slide itself, which are there and there. Now, I've never had any problems with those, but just for completeness, you can see the holes there. They need to be clear as well. And that is almost it. There's one hole left that I can think of, and that is, see this screw here? If you take this screw off, now this little stub that sticks out here with a hole in the centre that the screw is blocking up, this is where your vacuum gauge can fit on. And on the other side of that hole, if I stick this in, if we look round, this is now the engine side, we've got yet another hole that comes out to just there. So when the engine is running, this is where the depression will occur, and you can see how much depression there is there by putting a tube on this little stub pipe here and connecting that to your vacuum gauge. So that needs to be clear as well. But that can be cleared from the outside with the carburetor fully assembled. And that, I think, pretty sure, are all the air holes and all the petrol holes that need to be checked and cleaned on your Bing carburetor. Right, it's time to put it together, I think. We're now looking at the top of the slide and the diaphragm. Now, we need to check that the diaphragm hasn't got any holes in it. They sometimes perish and holes appear along this part of the diaphragm, either on top of this ridge, where I've found them have been either on top of that ridge or down on the other ridge, which is at the bottom. The way you check for them, find where this rib is, a little tooth there that sticks out. We only do that so we've got a place to start, and stretch the diaphragm slightly, just like that. Don't stretch it too hard, and if there's any perishes or any holes, then you'll see a white light coming through there. And then you go a little bit further, go round and stretch, and go round, and then keep going all the way round until you get back to the tooth again, so you know that the whole of the area has been inspected. And if it's okay, it's ready to go back into the carb. We're getting very close to reassembling this carburetor. Now, there are a couple of jobs that we need to do. You will remember this. This is the needle valve that fitted in this hole underneath the float, and this cuts the petrol off when the float gets up to the right height. Well, this was covered in that brown varnish. Now, we've cleaned the valve, but what we haven't done is cleaned the hole that it was in. Now, It's very tempting to get hold of a screwdriver and scrape this up and down the side to remove everything, but you don't really want to do that because the inside of this needs to remain smooth and the metal of the screwdriver could damage the surface of the brass tube that the valve sits in. So what I tend to do is have pieces of wood. Now this is a piece of 6mm doweling and it fits into the hole, and what I do is I've got some WD-40 I keep in a pot. I can put this into the WD-40, spin this around and then hold it at an angle like this, and I can rub up and down, round and round, and get rid of all that varnish that's stuck onto the side, and it works quite well. So that cleans off the inside of that hole. Also, the needle valve has got a sharp end, which is here, and that's the actual valve part. When that little taper has got a seat at the bottom of the hole. Now here's another piece of wood. This is actually a piece of bamboo. It is a kebab skewer, which I've roughly cut at this end, and I've cut it rough on purpose because it gives lots of little edges to help with the cleaning. Because put that in WD-40 down to the bottom of the hole. That's now in that seat, and I can rub the seat. I can turn it round like this. I can go up and down and make sure that it's all clean. Push a piece of rag down there or a piece of paper using the blunt end. Pull this out, check with the lens and make sure that that's all nice and clean. Once it is, we can go on to the next hole. The next hole is where the shroud fits. That's the shroud that goes around the needle jet. Then there's the main jet holder, and then the main jet itself. Now that shroud, which is just here, this is the first thing that goes into the hole before everything else goes in, and it seats against that surface there, which means at the bottom of this hole there is a seat, and this stick is now bumping against it. I'll put this into WD-40, scrape around on that seat, and clean that off. Once that's nice and clean, we then go on to the next hole. Now this hole has got the pilot jet in, which is just here, and the pilot jet seats against that face there, just at the top of the thread. And so we can use the kebab stick again, put WD-40 on, bring this down, scrape around the hole, check with the lens and make sure that's nice and clean. Once it is, we can then go on to this hole here, and this is going to be the last hole. This hole contains, or will contain, this, which is the idle air control screw, and this meters the air into the engine, and this is where you adjust your tick over. For it to adjust the tick over, you notice that it's got a sharp point sticking out. That's the metering valve part of it, and that goes into a hole which is at the bottom of this pig hole here. So more WD-40 on there, go around, clean everything, and once that's all done, get hold of the WD-40, squirt WD-40 in all of these, then blast it out with the compressed air, and at that point we should be ready to assemble the carburetor. Now we're going to start off with the centre hole. That's where the needle jet fits, and the main jet will fit on the top. The first thing that goes in is the needle jet shroud, which is this piece here, and that needs to go in with the holes at the top, and you drop that into the hole. Make sure that it's seated. I use my little bit of bamboo, and that's plopped through, and you can also feel it with your finger on the inside of the car because that sticks out into the venturi side. Once that's in, then the needle jet goes in, which is this piece here, and it goes with the small end down, and it's held in place on this face by the end of the main jet holder. So if we put that one in with the needle pointing down, and we're okay, and that's gone in the centre. Next thing to go in is the main jet holder. Now I don't like dry threads going in, so I just put a little dot of oil on the threads. It's just that I don't like the feeling of dry threads. This is all full up with petrol, so that will get washed out. Once we get that down to the bottom, we grab a 10mm spanner and tighten that up. Next to go in is the main jet, which is just here, with its large washer. The other carburetor, that main jet, has a large washer, and I've seen a picture in the manual, in the Haynes manual for this bike, and that has a large washer as well. So chances are they've all got large washers. and that is up. So that's the main jet holder, the needle jet, and the needle jet shroud. Next to go in is the pilot jet, which is this one here. And again, I'm just going to put a dab of oil on. That was a bit too much on there, so I just take that off the piece of paper. And now the needle jet goes in here, and we screw this in right the way down until it goes tight, which is just there. Next is the idle air screw, which is this one here, and that has a spring on it as well, and it goes into this hole. So we'll put I'm going to drop the spring in first, and on this thread and the top of the screw I'm going to put in just a little bit of copperies, and I put this on because I don't want the head of this screw going rusty, and this tends to keep it free of rust, or it stops a lot of rust forming, so it doesn't rust and get stuck into the hole. So I put that on there. We now drop this into the hole and into that spring like that. The idle air control screw needs to be set to its basic setting. Screw the screw in clockwise till it becomes tight, and then loosen one complete turn anti-clockwise. Right, next is the needle valve, just here, and that fits there, just under the float. And that goes in with the sharp end down, and there's a ball bearing here which is spring loaded just there, and that's a little shock absorber for the edge of the float. Here's the float, and the float is held in place with this pin just here, and this is the shaft that stays loose. So I'll put this through. No lubricant on this because this just bathes in petrol, so no lubricant will hang around there, and that's in position. Right, we can now get hold of the float bowl itself. There's no gasket sealant required on here, but what is required is the springs. I took that off to help. Now the spring goes on that way round with the loop towards the air intake side of the carburetor. Right. I'm going to pull it out and get that in the hole like that. And now the float bowl goes in here. This float bowl, and now we can push the spring up all the way to there, and that's the bottom half of the carb complete. Right, let's assemble the choke assembly next. Now there's a gasket that goes on this face between that and the choke assembly that is here. Now I've pushed the wheel back into the housing. I've put a little bit of grease on the shaft, and I've remembered to put the off-center dot towards this tube and the air filter side of the carburetor. This goes on there, and it has 4 screws, and on each of these screws I will be putting copperies, and that will ensure that they unscrew next time we want to take the carburetor apart. 3. Next to go on is the arm that operates the choke, and that goes on with the nut on the outside and the clamp for the piano wire on the inside, a washer, and then the nut. Just like that, and I've got to do that nut up. I'll do that in a moment. That's the choke in. The last thing to go in is the slide with its diaphragm. So we turn the carb up. We need to remember that there is a notch in there, or a little aperture for the notch. The notch is on the lip of the diaphragm, just there. So we need that notch to go in that aperture just there, which it is there. Make sure the diaphragm fits nicely all the way around here. The top of the diaphragm, this cover, needs to go on with these two features here on the same side as the choke and the throttle, because they hold the cables. This needs to go round that way. Now I'm just going to put a little bit of oil on this here, just a tap. There's a little drop on both sides, and now we can put this down on top of the slide and into position. We don't need any silicone sealer on here at all. 1, 2, always best on these castings to tighten the screws in a diagonal manner. So that was the first one I did, this is the second, and this is the third, and the fourth just here. Just check those again. 4. These two features here on the same side as the choke and the carburetor. If we stick our finger down here, you can lift the choke nicely and it returns under its own weight, so we know that that's in nicely and it's not binding on anything. And that is the carburetor all back together. Well, that's one carburetor all cleaned and sparkly looking. It's now time to get to the second one. I don't like swapping parts between the two carburetors, so what I like to do is get the first one back together before I start to strip down the second one. But just before we go, if you've enjoyed this video, can you do us a big favour? Click the thumbs up icon and subscribe if you haven't done already. These clicks will only take you a second, they will help the channel no end, and it won't cost you a copper penny. In the next episode we'll look at the ignition. We will remove and replace the points, we'll set the points gap, and then we'll set up the ignition timing. There's lots to look forward to. Could you do something like this? Of course you can. And with that, this video is at an end. Take care everybody, and I'll see you next time. Could you do something like this? Of course you can.